these men from the church. They busted in. They were all dressed up in camo and military, paramilitary apparel and so forth. And they had weapons. They had automatic style rifles and so forth. And they pretended to have a mass shooting.
Andrew Pledger, thanks so much for coming back on to Talk Beliefs from your home in South Carolina, USA. You are a writer and activist, as well as the host of the podcast Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism, where you talk with other BJU survivors and expose the school's dark history and teachings. Our last interview was very popular with the Talk Beliefs audience, so I thought it would be good to get you back on the show to talk to you about you, your activism, and your new podcast. Well, last time you were staying with a family who took you in after your expulsion from Bob Jones University, but now you're living in your own apartment, I see.
Hi, yeah, thank you for having me back. Yes, I have my own apartment with a roommate. And yeah, like so much has happened since our last interview. I did actually end up transferring my Bob Jones credits to an online college, SNHU, and I graduated from college a year ago. And, I continue to do work with Rachel Bernstein on the Indoctrination podcast, and I also do work with Dr. Yanya Lalich with the Lalich Center, which has been absolutely amazing. And yeah, I am in my own apartment now, and this happened a few months ago, and it was just the right next step for me, and I was ready. And yeah, I've been very busy, been working and doing a lot of podcasting with the Beyond BJU podcast. And before that, I did a limited series on Bob Jones called Surviving BJU, a Christian Cult, which I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later.
Before we dive into your new life and your new podcast, could you give us a brief overview of BJU, why it's so controversial, and why you had to leave?
Yeah, so Bob Jones University was started in 1927. And, the root of it has always been the same. It's all about separation. So Bob Jones Sr., he founded the college, and he really pushed this doctrine of separation. And so the doctrine of separation is really just these fundamentalist Christians separating from anyone, even other Christians who disagree with them. And so really fundamentalist Christianity and just fundamentalism, it was a reaction to modernism, and that's why Bob Jones University was started. The Scopes monkey trials with evolution, everything, that really scared a lot of fundamentalists because it challenged what they claimed was the authority of the Bible. And the Bible has to be taken literally in that environment. I know not everyone takes it that way, but in that camp, they have to take it literally. So anything that challenges their interpretation, they have to hide themselves from information and people who believe differently, or really separate or really isolate. So he created Bob Jones University to really create like this oasis away from the world, to really control language, control information, to indoctrinate students to really inoculate them against any different ideas. So indoctrinating them with creationism, believing that God created the world in 7 24-hour days, and that evolution is false, and that in their view, science really should validate everything in the Bible. And if science doesn't, then that science is wrong. And so it's the assumption that, the Bible has all the answers for everything across the board. And, it started in Florida and moved to Tennessee in the 30s. And then in 1947, it moved to Greenville, South Carolina, with that same separatist ideology. And I think what's important for people to understand about the doctrine of separation and fundamentalism, I also have learned that it is also a code word for segregation. A lot of Christian schools were started for the purpose of segregation. And that's another thing with Bob Jones. It has a very racist history. They did not allow African American students in the school until the 70s. And Bob Jones University banned interracial dating and marriage until 2000, which is pretty really like ridiculous and crazy that they were really racist for that long. But they lost their accreditation status, I think, like in the 80s over it, and there was a whole Supreme Court case and mess over it, and they lost, of course, and they lost their tax exempt status, and they eventually regained it. Not in 2000, I think it was like 2015 or 17 that it finally regained its status. But it has this long history of racism, and I've also learned that Bob Jones Sr. himself had connections to the KKK. There was a Bob Jones dormitory that was named after a KKK member, and the name was finally removed in 2011, I think. So it has, yes, a long history of racism. And, in addition to that, it has very typical like fundamentalist mindset, us versus them. Those who don't believe are evil, and we have to separate from them. We have the truth, and like if our truth is not working for you, you're at fault. If you don't agree 100%, then you're out. You're either for us or against us. And this environment really, this Christian fundamentalism in general, and at Bob Jones, you're expected to follow these impossible standards, and you're constantly self-criticizing and tearing yourself down and trying to get this approval, trying to reach these standards. And at Bob Jones University, they really have a snitching culture there where everyone is monitoring everyone else to make sure everyone is in line, and all the rules are seen as like the Bible. So, you disobey that, you're disobeying God. And one of their main teachings at Bob Jones and in fundamentalism is this idea of authority. So you always obey your authority no matter what. They are representatives of God. And if you go against authority in any way, you are going against God, and you'll be open up to Satan's attacks and even like removed blessings from God. So there's this fear and terror around going against what these leaders are saying. And so it creates this environment that is ripe for abusive behavior because they prioritize positions of power over the safety and protection of their members. And, another aspect of Bob Jones and their controversy is, of course, like their treatment of LGBTQ people. Bob Jones III himself said that gay people should be stoned and killed. He said this at the White House in the 80s. There was some get together of evangelicals, and he was one of them there. So they've always been very anti-LGBTQ, and they have a sexual abuse scandal of mishandling of sexual abuse claims. There was a outside organization called GRACE, which stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, and they investigated Bob Jones University's handling of sexual abuse claims and sexual abuse claims at this school. And they found that there were victims that were being silenced. There were victims that were being blamed for their assaults and shamed and told that they would ruin their families' lives if they did this, or they would ruin a pastor's reputation, or they would ruin a ministry, or they would ruin the reputation of Bob Jones University. And, this report came out, and it was very damning of how Bob Jones really mishandled so many sexual abuse claims and put things under the rug. And it was such a big deal that there's a whole article on it in the New York Times that happened around that time. I think it was like the early 2010s that this mainly happened. And I know that report is just the tip of the iceberg of the sexual abuse claims and the abuse in general that went on at the school. I went to Bob Jones University to really escape my upbringing, to escape the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement, its control, and my parents' control. And I saw Bob Jones as a way out, even though internally I wanted to leave fundamentalism because I recognized the harm that it did to me and the abuse that I experienced in that environment. And also being gay and fundamentalism was terrifying. And I was scared to go to Bob Jones University about really how I would be treated, what I would experience, fearing just being found out and trying to conform to the person that they really wanted me to be. And, for a while, I did not process my experiences at Bob Jones. I pushed it away. I said, oh, like the IFB was the main thing that impacted me. Bob Jones was just a few years. But yeah, so I realized the psychological harm in therapy from Bob Jones University, just the state of hypervigilance, always being watched, a lot of the teachings that are really worm theology, just breaking you down, making you feeling like you're absolutely worthless and that you cannot trust yourself and that you have to put your trust in these teachings and these rules and focusing on these outward behaviors as proof that you're good or that you're saved from eternal damnation. And just the homophobic teachings and while I was at the school, just being in this toxic high control culture of always feeling watched, having to reach these impossible standards all the time, but also experiencing harassment because of my perceived sexuality from people, experiencing stalking at the school also was something that had a major impact on me, and eventually being counseled for my sexuality, and which is really like their version of conversion therapy, and just never feeling like I belonged, always being on edge, always just feeling so worthless, just that shame. And I experienced a lot of mental health issues at the school from my past and things that they compounded on top of that. Like it was so difficult just living a life just of constant worry, constant hypervigilance. And it's something I've been able to start processing in therapy.
We got them all in, and there's of course going to be a message, a gospel message. And to set the tone for that message, once I got everyone into the gym and sat in the bleachers and so forth for the school, they had all of a sudden, a surprise to everyone except for those of us who were working there. These men from the church, they busted in. They were all dressed up in camo and paramilitary apparel and so forth. And they had weapons. They had automatic style rifles and so forth. And they had blanks and they made sounds. And they pretended to have a mass shooting, shut up the crowd and so forth. And that was, of course, intended to scare you into what would happen if you died tonight. And, where would you go? Heaven or hell? And we thought this was a good thing to do to win people to Christ, to have a mock mass shooting.
It's like, that is insane. Like,
your new podcast is Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism, where former students reveal what it was like to attend BJU. You've had two other podcasts before this one, Speaking Up with Andrew Pledger and Surviving Bob Jones University. Andrew, what does this new show have to offer, and do you approach it differently to your previous podcasts?
Yeah, so Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism, what really differs it from the first two? Well, Speaking Up was just people from all kinds of religions and different cults. And, I'm glad I did that. It helped me learn a lot in my podcasting journey and process and heal some parts of my own trauma. And Surviving Bob Jones University, it covered just the school and people's experiences at Bob Jones University. And it was just a limited podcast. And by the time it was done, I had messages from so many people who wanted to share their stories. So I decided to create another podcast called Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism, where it does share stories from people's experiences at Bob Jones University, but it shares stories from people's experiences at Bob Jones affiliated ministries. So that would be affiliated churches, day schools, camps, because Bob Jones' influence extends far beyond the university itself. And that's why I created Beyond BJU, to show the impact Bob Jones has had through all these different ministries and also in our society. So one of the ministries that I'm exposing on Beyond BJU is this camp ministry associated with Bob Jones called The Wilds, and it has never been exposed before. And there's a lot of intense indoctrination and really brainwashing and also mishandling of sexual abuse claims at this camp. So I'm excited to expose it in a 4-part series on Beyond BJU coming out in August. And yeah, it's been interesting to do this show. And it's been like exposure therapy for me, because just processing my own experiences at Bob Jones and listening to other people. After making the Surviving BJU podcast, a limited series, I really had the language and tools to really understand the system and really the impact of Bob Jones University and it really being a cult. And, Bob Jones University, it is a very authoritarian institution that uses control and manipulation to shape individuals into its desired image. And they prioritize outward appearance over genuine spirituality and blame and shame individuals who fail to meet its impossible standards. And this institution does provide certainty, structure, and community, but at the cost of individuality and autonomy. And it uses fear and shame to enforce conformity and destroying any sense of self-trust and fostering a dependence on these leaders. And the system also encourages really snitching, creating a culture of constant surveillance. And this kind of environment, it just leads you on a path of isolation, not being able to build authentic connections with people. And it's just very, very oppressive. And this is just kind of the common experience that I have seen across the board with me and a lot of other survivors.
You're exposing an empire.
It was all lies. The whole church turned a blind eye to the abuse that happened.
None of this was ever your fault.
These people will answer for what they did. I'm not going to be quiet again. If not on this earth, in front of God.
We will not be silenced. There's so much to tell you about it.
Well, thankfully, more and more podcasts like yours are popping up that are exposing the harm of fundamentalism and coercive control. We're also seeing more documentaries than ever before on cults and similar groups. Recently, a documentary on the IFB, Let Us Pray Ministry of Scandals, a series covering the physical and sexual abuse of the Independent Fundamentalist Baptist movement, premiered on the ID Network and the Max streaming service. So, did you see it, and what was your take on it?
Yeah, I did end up seeing this series, and I ended up doing it in a couple of nights with whiskey with a friend to get through it. And, it was really, I think, validating that this was put out to expose a toxic and harmful culture of the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement. And the series specifically covered the sexual abuse, but it did cover the teachings and how it enabled such a toxic environment for any of these horrible, awful things to even take place. And, overall, I think they did a really great job with this series, and it was validating as an IFB survivor to see it. But the only thing I wish they would have really covered more was Jack Hyles. And something I haven't talked about as much is that my parents, they did follow Jack Hyles in the 80s and early 90s. They went to his college, Hyles-Anderson, and his church, First Baptist of Hammond, which is covered a bit in the docu-series. And that's, my parents met because of Hyles-Anderson and Jack Hyles, and that's why I'm here. But they have a past with that. And by the time I was born, they were at a different IFB church cult in North Carolina. And so, yeah, it was interesting to see a little bit of him on the documentary, but I know there is so much more with him.
Here comes old Ortiz. Good morning, Brother Hiles. How you doing? You know how Mexicans wake up in the morning? He said, but I'm a Puerto Rican. I said, Puerto Rican ain't nothing but a second-hand Mexican.
Jack Hyles, like he is like the main cult leader of the IFB movement. There is a massive bus ministry in his college sending out all these graduates to plant all these different IFB churches. But over the years, like Jack Hyles, he has faced multiple accusations of sexual misconduct, financial misappropriation, and even just doctrinal errors. And in 1993, WJBK aired a new series called Praying from the Pulpit. And the theme of the series was really that allegations of child molestation, abuse, and sex scandals across several churches traced its way back to First Baptist Church of Hammond and Hyles Anderson. And, you know, besides the abuse in this Praying from the Pulpit series, the program also examined Hyles' teaching, including a 1990 sermon where Jack Hyles pretended to pour poison into a glass and asked an associate pastor to drink from it. And, you know, the report in this program said, you know, it was really like a ring to Jonestown and the mass suicide of followers of Jim Jones. And, you know, that was just one aspect of just kind of the culture that was there. And, you know, Hyles was sued for failing to protect a woman with a disability from sexual assault. And, like, despite his denial of the allegations, several lawsuits were settled out in court. He was accused of a decade-long affair with a secretary. He had a very extravagant lifestyle while all of his followers were just struggling to get by and make ends meet. But, you know, I think a whole series could be done on just Jack Hyles to cover his beginnings, his starting at First Baptist of Hammond, how he gained control of his followers, his fancy lifestyle, and the scandals, I think, just of his own cult. Overall, I really loved the Let Us Pray documentary and the how it exposed sexual abuse in the IFB and the teachings and the structures that enabled it.
Well, it's Pride Month as we record this, so I think it's appropriate to ask what your journey has been like as part of the LGBT community, especially as someone coming out of fundamentalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's definitely been a journey of dealing with purity culture, internalized homophobia, and the indoctrination runs deep. So I realized even though I left that system did not leave me. So I really had to unpack a lot of the teachings and how it impacted me and my body, and really just exploring myself and getting through those mental blocks that would stop me from experiencing myself. So I think for me, like, starting to feel safe in my body was like a first step in general to that. And that's a journey that I've recently been able to start feeling and experiencing, and starting to really connect with LGBTQ people in my local area as we deal with a lot of the conservative politics here in Greenville. And even just starting to date, like, it's been a while since I've done that, been comfortable with that, but really just accepting myself where I am to explore those feelings and to feel safe in that and to feel good. It's been quite a 2.5 year journey, but I'm glad I'm finally starting to like overcome some of the indoctrination around my sexuality that I was exposed to.
And on top of everything else you're doing, you're also writing a book. So where are you with this project? Is there anything you could tell us about?
Yeah, so I am writing a memoir, and I've been writing it really since 2019. It started at Bob Jones University, and it was just a document for me just to get my experiences out. And I eventually realized I wanted this to be a memoir, and I took a year break from it So I was supposed to start back to it of May of 2023, but I got busy with my Surviving BJU podcast, and it ended up being a year break. And I wasn't ready really to get into it at that time. But as I've been away from it, and especially last fall, I decided to pick the story structure and really just the theme of the book, because I've realized with any good memoir, there is a universal thing that people relate to and a core human experience that people relate to. And I'm really excited about my memoir because it's more than just my experiences growing up in the IFB and discovering my sexuality, and even just the impact from the abuse that I experienced. It's about being different in an environment that values sameness or conformity. And, it digs into all the specifics of my journey, but the core of my story is a deep desire to really belong. And it's about the core. The memoir is more than just my story of surviving a religious cult. It's about the human need to belong, the extents people will go to for acceptance, and the pain and loneliness that comes from alienation and social rejection. And it's a story about how true belonging happens when we belong to ourselves, and that in order to find belonging, sometimes we have to leave everyone and everything we've ever known. So I think anyone who's ever felt different or out of place or felt like they never belonged will relate so much to the memoir when it is released. And several things I hope the memoir will achieve is to reveal the impact of fundamentalism on queer people, and also to validate other survivors of the IFB. And the third thing I want to achieve is that all the readers will know that they can truly belong and that they are not alone in feeling alienated, and because of the difference that they have in themselves, and that everyone deserves to find belonging.
Andrew, it's been great catching up with you and hearing about all your new activities. You really are one of the shining lights in this current wave of activists working hard to educate the public on the harms of fundamentalism. I will leave links to your social media and, of course, your podcasts in the description below. And all that's left to say is thank you very much indeed for coming back on To Talk Beliefs.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me back on. I really, really enjoyed this conversation.